Good morning. I was hoping they would play the Guantanamera as I. Wonderful to be here with you today. One of the biggest topics in our community is what do we call ourselves, or what do we allow other people to call us? Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Latin, and the one I heard yesterday for the first time, Latinx. And it's still a contentious space. Labels are always double-edged swords, right? Even that public recognition of us as a racial group is relatively new in our history. And there are advantages to it. It's about representation. It has purchasing power. It's political identity. And it's about coming together to build power as a community. But it's a binary. It's always a binary. It's a dichotomous choice, and that's tricky because the richness of our racial identities within our community is masked under that one term, and the complicated histories that we descend from. In reality, we are descendants of at least three things: the indigenous people of the land, before it was Colombia or Bolivia or Mexico or Cuba; the African slave trade across the Americas. We are also descendants of Spanish colonizers, plus later U.S. colonization and intervention across Latin America and the Caribbean. And we wear that in our faces and in our bodies, that beautiful complexity. I mean, just look around. Look at the diversity of everyone that we're celebrating here today. And I want to commend the organizing committee for that commitment to diversity in representation and who is here, who was made possible to be here today. And it was showcased at the beautiful installation at the Meadows, right? We are Jennifer Lopez, we are Jorge Ramos, we are Dolores Huerta, we are Celia Cruz, and we are Gwen Eiffel. And we are a community that is a product of and continues to enforce racial biases that perpetuate white supremacy. So that diversity is our strength, but it's also a part of our weakness. We are both victims of it and agents of it because we bring internalized racism. And that's the subject of this panel. And we're going to unpack it. We're going to talk about the harm it's causing us. We're going to talk about what's at stake because of it and what we must do individually and collectively to repair it. And we could talk about this all day, but we only have 45 minutes. So I'm thrilled to be joined by my fellow panelists. First, please welcome to our panel. She is, there we go. She is the co-founder and vice executive director of Comunidades Indígenas del Liderazgo, an organization advocating and working to amplify the voices and experience of indigenous people. Born in LA, she is the member of the Zapotec people and also launched a podcast, Tun Dali, a podcast for and by indigenous people. Please welcome Janet Martinez. Those of you who were lucky enough to take part in the reading and conversation at Explore Books on Tuesday, if you did that, you already know what a fantastic actor and author he is. He is a storyteller across multiple platforms, including a podcast and a new book on the way called Brown Enough. Please welcome Christopher Rivas. Finally, we are so privileged to have as our panel someone whose work spans over 4 decades, dedicated to linking communities of African descent, and her research exploring belief systems in the African diaspora. She is a creator and president of Creative Justice Initiative and co-founder of Corredor Afro and based in Puerto Rico, Dr. Marta Moreno Vega. Hi, guys. Thank you. And again, so thrilled to be joined by this incredible group of folks, the perfect folks to take us into this conversation. And I want to start with a quote from Christopher's book, Brown Enough. Bring us into the conversation with that fantastic, compelling quote of your own history and your work and why you're doing the work around Brown Enough and why you're leading with racial equity in your work and your career.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. A quote. It's a little longer than a quote, so we're going to read just a little bit of the book just to give some context. It's from the last chapter in the book. It's called Alchemy of Brownness. There's a quote at the top. It says, "The thing America fears most is the browning of America." Richard Rodriguez. People often ask me if I'm Middle Eastern. I say, nope, I'm Latin. They say, oh, cool, 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 where you from? New York, I say. Oh, you Puerto Rican? They respond with confidence. Nah, Dominican. Oh, that's cool, I know some Dominicans. Wow, that's cool, I know some white people, I say. We're even. In the Dominican Republic, I'm everything from white to prieto to cocolo, referring to my non-Hispanic African descendants, to mulatto, referring to my mixed African and European ancestry. When someone isn't sure about me, they say, mira detrás de los orejas, look behind the ears, as if that is where my blackness is hiding. In Colombia, I am trigueño, light brown or coffee-colored, or possibly mestizo of mixed race, having Spanish and indigenous descent. In many Spanish-speaking places, they would advise me against calling myself Afro-Latino, because if I am light-skinned enough to pass, then I should choose to pass. In America, I am brown. In many a cab, I am South Asian. I have been told I look like someone's Armenian, Indian, or Greek cousin more than a dozen times. In some malls where they have those Dead Sea beauty products they sell very aggressively, I am Israeli. I have had a handful of people tell me, I like Latins. They're lovers, not fighters. One, that's actually very historically inaccurate. Spaniards were pretty fucking vicious. And two, you don't know me. In Hollywood, I am just enough of a mutt and a little bit of everything that they call me ethnically ambiguous. This means exactly what it sounds like. I look ambiguous enough that my ethnicity cannot be identified. It's a way of labeling me by not labeling me. It means for studios and advertisers, I check multiple race boxes at once, which is super great for their diversity and inclusion numbers. I'll admit, I am aware of my odd privilege of being ambiguous. There's something about people not being able to know quite where I'm from. When they look at me, it allows me movement. I can dance, hang, and hide in multiple spaces and circles, but also it never truly allows me a safe place to call home. What is brownness? The vague but large gap in the middle where things are forgotten, often don't exist, don't matter, and don't belong. What is brownness? A concept, an ambiguous identity that doesn't offer the same diasporic bond as being black, yet it provides none of the power or grace that comes with navigating the world as white. What is brownness? Everything between black and white. What is brownness? The global majority. It's all just a spectrum. It all depends on who you ask, what they stand for, where you are, what you want, what they need, what you acknowledge, when and where.
So that's what we're going to unpack on this panel in the next 40 minutes. I actually want to go from that, which captures our multiplicity of experiences today, to start with a little bit of history. And I'd like to ask Dr. Moreno to actually give us a little bit of a teach-in on this legacy of brownness and a painful legacy of colonization that has us look the way we look, and just kind of give us that context of how did we become so diverse?
First of all, we have
Mike?
It's on? Buenos dias. The first thing we have to do is get rid of mythology. We've all learned mythology in miseducation. So whether you went to a public school or a private school, you've been miseducated. So understand that, accept it, and then work at changing it. More than 15 million Africans were torn out of West and Central Africa. Over 400 plus years. Because even when we say enslavement ended, it didn't end. Because our people were not allowed to own land. There were laws that said we were less than. And in fact, in Mexico, they had, in the 15th century, had paintings that talked about caste. So, well, basically, his introduction introduces you to el sistema de casta. Si te casaste con un indio, era mestizo. Era blanco y mestizo. Si te casaste con un negro, mulata o mulato. ¿Verdad? Veo que dice, ¿verdad? Y después si era segunda generación, tercera generación, cuarta generación, habían nombres. There were names for who you married and the shade that you acquired in those marriages. And that gave you privilege because it gave you closer to whiteness, right? And being closer to whiteness was just an acknowledgement of who owned you, who directed you, who had power over you. And the first thing we have to start with is the Native community. Because the Native community was here, the lands were stolen because of white supremacy. I looked, when I went into my room and there was a picture of a Native chief, and I just chilled. Because the mythology is that our people, our Native peoples, don't exist. And genocide was part of white supremacy. Y después I'm gonna hurt some hearts. So be prepared to be hurt. Part and parcel and driver of enslavement was the Catholic Church. And if we don't acknowledge the Catholic Church being part of our enslavement, no estamos en nada. Right? Because the Catholic Church gave permission, right, in quotes, for Spaniards and Portuguese to go out and enslave people and define people as less than. And we have to acknowledge it and call it. Porque se hicieron ricos en la espalda de los indígenas y nosotros los africanos y descendientes de africanos. So white supremacy is grounded and colorism is grounded in economics and politics. People got wealthy, right, off our backs, off our ancestors' backs. And we have to acknowledge that. And in that process, to make us feel less than and make our ancestors feel less than was the sistema de casta. ¿Verdad? And we still have that. No porque tiene la nariz muy grande, no porque el pelo está muy rizo. ¿Verdad? Quítate ese afro porque ese es pelo malo. Todo eso lo aprendimos. Right?
We have entered the bilingual portion of this program.
Well, I think it's very important to be bilingual. And if you don't know Spanish, learn it. Because if we're going to talk about honoring our ancestors, abuelos and abuelas, we need to use language as a defense. But speaking Spanish también is a colonial language, so let's not get it twisted. Right? Because a lot of people go, no, porque yo hablo español y tú sabes, no hablas, tú hablas más que inglés. No, we have to learn all our languages. And Janet will talk to you about what she's doing because I am so in awe of the work that she is doing.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So that one of the things that we have to understand is we have choices. In 2022, we have choices. Right now in California, there are Chicanos working in corporations and in factories, abusing African Americans, holding up bananas, llamando a los negros, right? Dándole trabajo menos del de ellos. So one of the things that I will end with, right, is that all of us acknowledge some level of spirituality or religion. Mi mamá me enseñó that the way I am treated, I treat back. That I treat the way I want to be treated. Nobody has to love me other than my mama and my family. I was taught, right? Because my mother was protecting me, my father were protecting me from the knife of racism outside of my community. Yo me crié en el barrio en New York. Ellos de Puerto Rico. Right? Y yo salí de casa hablando español because my mother knew that when I went to school, I was going to get an education that erased me. And that discussion we had yesterday, right? About erasure. And part of the isms that we are still experiencing is because our children are still learning miseducation. They're not seeing themselves in books. And if they see themselves in chains, not as agents of change, not as agents with history. No vamos lejos. Look at Florida. The move to censor books is spreading across the country.
Woo.
Who are they censoring? Nosotros, right? The most critical point that we have to address as a community, right, is the content of education. Because we've been taught that education is our salvation. Y te voy a decir que no, because if you learn to hate yourself, if you learn not to see yourself in what you're reading, then you're invisible. Then your people are invisible. Your achievements are invisible. Y eso no puede ser.
Thank you.
Because if we go back historically, and I'll end with that, the pyramids in Mexico, in Africa, predate Europeans.
Thank you.
So thank you for listening.
No, thank you. I told Dr. Moreno, can you do a little bit on history and how colonization factors in? And in like 5 minutes, she did from colonization to Florida, to CRT in Florida, okay? Because this is all connected. So Janet, tell us about your work. Tell us about erasure of the indigenous community and what's hidden when we say Latino, Latinx, why it matters that we be seen, heard, and indigenous people be counted.
So I just want to say, no, Marta, thank you so much for those words. It was a beautiful segue into kind of our work, right, with Cielo. I'm the co-founder of Cielo, an indigenous women-led organization. And I kind of want to do a pop quiz with the audience, right? Since we're talking about erasure, how many of you know how many indigenous languages are spoken in Mexico? Can you just shout it out? So according to the Mexican government, officially there are 68 indigenous languages. Of those, there are variants of those languages, which yes, it can, like some of the languages like Mixteco, have 80 different ways to speak it. All right, second pop quiz question. How many indigenous languages are spoken in Guatemala? Close, close. Anybody know? All right, it's 22 Mayan indigenous languages más Xinca and Garifuna that are spoken in Guatemala, right? So I think it's important to name the languages to see that there is a deficit of us knowing each other within the Latinx community, right? Like we say Latino, Latina, like if it's like a label that engulfs everybody and everybody's included, but I think the reality is that we're seeing that we lack a lot of information. We know very little about the populations of indigenous people in Mexico and Guatemala. And I want to push it further and say that if we look at the statistics from Mexico, we can start again. For higher education, only 1% of indigenous people go to higher education. 1%. I mean, that's crazy, right? Because it shows us that there is structural racism that marginalize indigenous communities because, kind of like Martha said, from colonization to today, we still rely on the exploitation of indigenous people's labor, of their lands, of their resources, and we see an outward migration into the United States. And when we come here, people aren't counted here in the United States. According to the census, there's only 15 to 19,000 indigenous folks from Latin America in all of the United States. That's ludicrous. That's ludicrous because it touches a little bit into our work where we did the Undocumented Indigenous Fund where we placed around $2.4 million. We just finished this year with our Solidarity Aid Fund, and we were able to give out to individuals and their families that totaled around 11,000 indigenous folks in Los Angeles County alone. This means that we got most of the census numbers. This means that I guess we did most of the census work, that we have the same numbers in one city. Impossible. It doesn't make sense because we know that we provide interpretation all throughout the United States, that there's indigenous communities in Chicago, there's indigenous communities in New York, there's communities in Los Angeles that we've done interpretation training for. And I think sometimes when we push the narrative of being Latino, Latina, without really kind of dissecting, unpacking what that means and who's under those labels, we really have a push for erasure. And I don't want to go into the impact yet because I know that that's like for another question, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. And I think what we're hearing and what I think was captured is this great quote from an activist who said, for us in Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean, proximity to Europeans, proximity to whiteness was about a survival. But now, today, as Dr. Moreno said, we have a choice. And I'm going to flip that around and say our survival today is about acknowledging that history, acknowledging our diversity, valuing our diversity. We don't have to stick with that narrative of white supremacy and, racial apartheid. But I want to get a little personal too. And what is the harm that we cause to ourselves, to each other, and to our force and power as a community when we perpetuate this white validation, this white supremacy, when we continue to perpetuate value based on the color of our skin, the texture of our hair, the structure of our face, the language that we speak. Christopher, can you take us into that conversation?
Yeah, so you talked about being seen a lot, and I felt like my language as a child was through my education was through the television, and none of the boys on TV looked like me. And that created great harm in me. They didn't have my nose, my hair, my skin, and if they did, they were being sort of made fun of or they were less than. But the cool guys on TV were not me. They were not my pops. And I wanted to be like them. And so without knowing it, you subconsciously create some self-hate in you. You try and transform yourself to that. So maybe it's even less about survival and more about fitting in or finding your place. I need to challenge that before you learn Spanish, right? Like if you don't speak it, learn it. you have to do the work of like, why don't I know it? Why didn't my parents teach me? What does it mean that I'm Dominican, so that means there's genocide and anti-blackness in my blood, right? One of the worst genocides of all time against the Haitians. What does it mean that I'm Colombian? There's a ton of anti-blackness in my blood. Like, why did my parents decide to send my sister to the Dominican Republic but not me? So before we do that, I think we have to ask ourselves these big uncomfortable questions. What am I a child of? What am I a product of? Before my parents even got here, right? When my parents were born, they didn't even have the option to put Hispanic or Latino on the census. They didn't exist. There was no box for them. As if a box can even contain us now. We're uncontainable in a box. And so there's tremendous harm, but before you even get into the harm, you have to be willing to ask yourself these uncomfortable questions to do the work. There's so much ugly colonialism, white supremacy, even anti-blackness braided into each and every one of us in this room. And to do that unbraiding takes a lot of work. And it ain't always pretty, but it is necessary work, I believe.
And I want you all to, yes. I want you all to speak to this a little bit, but you also captured that it's not just cultural and social, it's government imposed. It's imposed through systems and institutions, whether it's the census or, you know, efforts in our home countries at blanqueamiento, right? So we impose it through our language. We impose morenito, you know, there's some way worse, you know.
The no seas
slang.
indio is very popular.
Which one?
The no seas indio.
No seas indio, exactly.
You know, the Oaxaquita is also very popular, a
Yes.
term that a lot of people use.
There's a whole language in reinforcing it, and there's a system and institutional way of enforcing it. So, Dr. Moreno, can you also, you know, take, again, I want to pull out the harms to us, to ourselves, to each other from this, you know, embedded white supremacy.
Well, I think he started addressing it, and that you have to look within our families and community and what it means within our communities and what it means outside of our communities, right? Because we basically live dual lives, right? And we've learned to double exist in the world, right? Which I think is wonderful. A lot of people say, oh, that's so sad. No, I think it's wonderful that we can code switch, right? At home, you go through many of the experiences, arreglate ese pelo, or I lived in my life in trenza, right? Growing up, I was braided every day because el pelo era malo. But then it goes into the gradations that we have in our community. Right? My cousin era rubia, o es rubia, con el pelo, con los ojos azules, right? My cousin is blonde, blue-eyed, right? And then the spectrum to me, right? And we both have the same name. So my aunt would say, ay, Marta la rubia. Ay, Marta la del pelo malo. We have that in our families, because our families have internalized racism and the aesthetic of whiteness, right? Then when you go outside, what does it mean in terms of getting an actor's job? What does it mean in terms of getting a job as a teacher? What does it mean getting a job as a professional in any situation, as a secretary, right? As a professor. We don't have professors generally that have tenure. Most of our professors are adjuncts, Black, Native, compared to whites. So it talks to intelligence, because you know that we had in this country and in all countries some form of testing who's intelligent and who's not. And even to going to scientifically trying to prove that our brains and our learning ability is less than. Eugenics is the science, right, of making us stupid. Right? There are scientific tests throughout this country still testing our intelligence, the intelligence of Native peoples, of African peoples, of peoples that are otherized.
There are voting forms that do that too.
Excuse me?
Voting forms.
Voting boards are also part of that. So I think that one of the things that we have to commit to is that a family is our institution, community is our institution, and they should be safe institutions. So that you have to decide, we all have to decide that when we're going to say something that is wrong and continue a mythology of hurt, we need to stop it. We need to make that choice. In 2022, you make that choice. I don't ask you, like my mother used to say, oh, love me, or hug me. No. You have to respect me. And at any point that you're disrespected, you have to talk on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Moreno. Janet?
I just kind of wanted to respond to this question that he posed, right? Why don't we learn our languages? Do I speak Zapotec? Both my parents speak Zapotec. I don't speak Zapotec, right? And the question is, why? Why don't I speak Zapotec? Why? Because both of my parents migrated as children to the United States. They went to LAUSD, which is our school district in Los Angeles. And I remember my dad telling me, they asked me if I spoke English, and I nodded because I didn't know what they were telling me. Because his primary language was Zapotec. The school district has a lot of indigenous children from then when he went to school in the 70s to now when we see the work that we're doing at Cielo in 2022. There are a lot of indigenous language speakers in our school systems that superintendents, nobody knows. They're all just kind of like, there are some good teachers that are like, I know I have indigenous language speaking students, so I try to make clubs, and there are like individual efforts, but I think that we need to see more of those individual efforts of people educating themselves, making the choice to Google, right? Google is free, to learn about the different communities that you serve. I know in a lot of places there is a large indigenous migration, but I think like those questions are like at a personal level as to why I didn't learn the language that expand to kind of more of a like bigger conversation, because if we see Mexico's indigenous languages, they went in 1820 to 65% to in 2010 to 6.6% of language speakers. That means that they lost a lot of language speakers, that there are very few indigenous language speakers left because of colonization, because of white supremacy, because we want to assimilate, because we fear for our children when they go to school systems that they're going to be mistreated, that they're not going to have the same access to education because of our languages, right? And I think that also that's another conversation that, you know, kind of Martha brought up right now about like, if there's hurt, like speak on it. Like, did I get some pushback even in this space when I said indigenous languages, and they would look at me and say, you mean dialects, right? No, I mean languages, right? And I think that that's like one of the spaces that we need to work from, that we're reclaiming that they're languages because they are languages, right? Not in the kind of Western thought that we have that it has to be written in a Greek alphabet, but like outside of that, because we have to exist outside of those paradigms that they've put for us. Like, this is what a language has to qualify, right? We need to start pushing outside of those boxes and creating safe spaces. For us, at least, there was no statistics on indigenous migrant populations in Los Angeles. We created them, we mapped them. There was no resources for indigenous folks in Los Angeles. So we started creating COVID vaccination clinics, food box centers, so that we can address the food insecurity that we're seeing in families after the pandemic. But we were trying to be solution oriented. When it comes to how we see ourselves, we started creating language classes for Zapoteco, Mixteco, and Maya Yucateco. We have an indigenous literature conference, but because we're trying to create safe spaces for ourselves that work outside of trying to go into other institutions. Like, for us, it was about creating safe spaces, because I wish that my parents would have had the opportunity to have those safe spaces, to feel safe in speaking their languages, safe enough to pass it on, and know that you can speak English, Spanish, and Zapotec without having the fear of having racism or prejudice. And I think that that's like a conversation that we also need to talk about, right? Like the stuff that we confront and the stuff that we perpetuate and are complicit in having this structural racism affect us, but we are also complicit in it because we replicate it by saying, oh, you don't speak a language, you speak a dialect, you know? And I think that these are important conversations that that also need to be addressed that sometimes are painful, right? Because we're all supposed to be Latinos, we're all supposed to be Latinas, Latinxes in this space, and we're all supposed to be community. But what does that look like if we're not able to see everybody's diversity, right, and the different experiences, and that there are different grades of experiences that we have because of colonization and how they've affected it to today?
Fantastic. There's this quote that I love from this great book called Inventing Latinos. And you know, we're highlighting this today. We're unpacking it. We're illuminating the harm from it. Because in this, this quote says, racism works best when it is taken for granted, when its structure and scaffolding are more or less invisible. And it takes a personal toll, it takes economic toll, and it takes a toll on our community. And I want, Christopher, you to maybe speak a little bit to what are you doing through your work to bring visibility to it, to bring knowledge and awareness to this, the richness of our community based on your own personal story and narrative, but what are you doing through your work and career?
You said racism works best when it's invisible, right? Howard Gardner in A People's History of America says, the greatest trick America ever pulled was to convince someone that it was better to be poor and white than poor and black. I love that. Baldwin says, when we did slavery, we put everyone in a cage, even white people. Everybody's in the cage, we just don't know it. And nobody's free until everybody's free. Freedom to me means unplugging from whiteness. Really and we've seen The Matrix, that shit can be hard, you know? But like really unplugging. Why do what's attached here, what's attached here, what's attached here? My art is about unplugging. My art is about creating and telling stories that disrupt traditionally white binary spaces. I make them entertaining because sugar helps the medicine go down. And so a couple projects we have are this book, definitely pre-order it.
How can we get that book?
You can get it everywhere you can get a book, online. And we got some postcards right here. And Bookshop would be great if you do bookshop.org because it gives money back to independent bookstores. Also listen to the Rubirosa podcast. It's about Porfirio Rubirosa. That is the Dominican man that James Bond was based on. Twice the richest man in the world, married to Barbara Hutton, Doris Duke, Flor Trujillo, was followed by the FBI for 17 years, lived in Hitler's Germany, Fidel's Cuba. But really, this man disappeared, and he's an example of what it means to be a brown man desperate to be seen by the white world. And the white world literally stole him, took his essence, turned it into something else. A lot of art. We have a Brown Enough podcast coming out. I'm teaching a workshop in Mexico called Freedom Out Loud. I'm plugging from whiteness. You can hit me up about that. Yeah, I'm just telling stories. And I think every time I'm on television, it's a win for everybody because it's about being seen, like you said. And that's the goal of my work. I want young brown kids to feel seen, to know that their stories and their experiences matter. And when you feel seen, you take up more space. And when we take up more space, we're less oppressed. And my mission is that all of us take up more space. And I know that when we leave this conference, we will take up more space. So I thank you.
Dr. Moreno, can you also take us into the what should we be doing, thinking, creating? Tell us what you're doing and what we should be doing.
Well, at the point that I understood white supremacy and miseducation, I started building institutions. One of those institutions is El Museo del Barrio. I'm the second director. It started as a classroom, and now the institution is 50 years old, and it's an institution in El Barrio, in a Puerto Rican community. Then I developed the Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diaspora Institute, the Association of Hispanic Arts, Global Caribbean Network, and a series of institutions. Why? Because I understood that my home was an institution. And I learned my values, my ethics because of my parents. And we need spaces. And I acknowledge Monica and Olga for having the fortitude to build Latino House. Because our people need a place to go and see themselves reflected. They need to go and hear conversations that make sense and destroy mythology. And I say mythology purposefully because the history they're learning is a myth. So that if we don't write books, the importance of books, the importance of literature, the importance of poetry, the importance of cooking. A mí cuando yo viajo me hace falta los plátanos, me hacen falta, right? So food is our culture, you know. The stories that our abuelas tell us, those have to be recorded, those have to be printed. All of us have to become cultural keepers. That's our responsibility. It's our responsibility. And now with cell phones, you can interview anyone and retain those stories. Those stories cannot be lost. That's why movies are so important. I have a granddaughter who's 5. And she insisted that I see Encanto and all of the Disney stories. And then I said, holy shit, those are our stories. Those are our stories. Why aren't we telling them? We have a responsibility to create our own spaces and our own institutions. That's our responsibility. Because going forward, that's where our children will go. That's where their children will go. And if we don't decide to do that, and I know we need jobs. I teach at a university and do all of that. But that job ends at a certain point, and you can invest your time in your own, right? So we have to sort of celebrate that duality that we continue to have. And if we can do it 24/7, better. But we have to create safe spaces that allow us to grow healthy, right? Because everybody talks about healing. How the hell are you going to heal when somebody's kicking your butt? How the heck are you going to heal? I have 2 sons, 2 black sons. Son hombre, but I'm afraid for them to go out still. And they say like, man, we're men, we got kids. Yeah, but I need to know that you got home that night, right? And in New York, to raise 2 sons that are healthy, that are living and that are thriving, right? And not part of the prison system that is the new enslavement, that's an accomplishment. If anybody asks me what my accomplishment is raising 2 sons. Mm-hmm. It's a manhood. Mm-hmm. Huh? Yes, absolutely.
Janet?
Solutions. Now we're going to be solution-based, right? So I think that number 1, educate yourself, right? Educate the communities you serve. I know that a lot of social workers are here, people in public health, like getting to know the community you serve and not just being satisfied with Latino, Spanish speaker, the end. That was all the homework we needed to do. But really investigate, talk to the community that you serve. I think that that's also really important. But also, I just want to say, like, there's a lot of organizations here, a lot of people that are change makers, and I really, really hope that that's where the change happens, right? There's this great thought leader. Her name is Yasnaya Elena Aguilar, and she's an Ayuk. And one of the stories she told us was really beautiful. We had a retreat, and she was telling us about indigenous futures. What does she see as indigenous futures? And one of the things she said was, I'm always gonna bet on my community to save me. She's like, if like this environmental landfall is, if there's a landslide on me in my community, I know that I'm gonna count on my community to come and dig me out of the rubble instead of the government. And I think that that was one of the most powerful takeaways from her talk for me, because it taught me, again, that we need to bet on the collective organizing of all of us together, because that's what's gonna save us, because the government isn't gonna come to save us. Like it's actively working against us, right? Like that's what we're seeing, that they're pushing white supremacy, that capitalism is expulsing people from their, places of origin. And I think that's something that we also really need to challenge, is the myth of the American dream, right? Like we keep saying like, hey, like we're all here for the American dream, but really a lot of us have been displaced, right? Like if you see communities, we're doing a documentary for my hometown association, which is a Zapotec hometown association. And when the initial Bracero program happened, they said there was a plague that infested our crops. The next year, there was no water. And so we were in a really bad situation. And they said somebody from Mexico City that had migrated previously went to Oaxaca City, walked from Oaxaca City to Sogocho, and let us know that there was this program. We didn't have money to go. We had to borrow from the church. The church gave us the money. 85 of us left. When we came back, we gave donations to start a school because there was no school. And that again tells me that it's the collective, right, that's coming to help. It's not the government that's gonna solve these infrastructure problems because they're counting on the structural racism to keep marginalizing us. So I really am hopeful leaving this conference and having these hard conversations, you know, and going back home and doing our work and then coming back collectively to see where we're at.
Somebody needs to give me my time. How much time do we have?
2 minutes and 33.
Whoa, okay. So, but I can't touch this without also, you know, we need for folks to be allies with us. We also need to be allies and to the racial justice community in the United States. We need to build these cross-racial alliances between Latinos, Indigenous, Black Americans, African Americans, Afro-Latinos. That's critical and crucial to our experience here. We need to say, you know, we are Black too. We are Indigenous too. We are mestizo, we are morenos, we are all of this. And that's how we build cross-racial alliances. And that's also how folks can see Latinos in the journey and evolution of racial progress in the United States. I am part of a team and an initiative that is about eradicating as much as we can through philanthropy, you know, building a more just society. And I've always said that our work is rooted in anti-Blackness and also extends to the broader tapestry of diversity in our country, including Latinos, including others. So the way we become allies and a stronger community is actually to recognize the diversity in our community. And when we see that being erased, to call it out, whether it's on a panel or in the workspace or just one-on-one, you know, between friends and in our community. So I hope that this panel has been illuminating in that way. And if this conference is about building power for our community, we are more empowered when we recognize the diversity and all the ways that our journey from our lands that we came from to being here, we are not a binary, but we are part of a racial progress journey across the Americas. And white supremacy both affects us, so we are the victims of it, and I'm going back to the beginning. We have a choice, like Dr. Moreno said, in whether we also become agents of it to ourselves and to our neighbors. Any final words from you all?
Well, I don't like anti-Black. I like pro-Black.
Yes.
Pro-Native, pro-us.
Pro-Native, okay, so great. Pro-Native, pro-Black.
I say, I know that there are certain terminologies that are used and everybody thinks they're good. And I think they're not. All right? So people say anti-Blackness. I say pro-Blackness.
Yes.
Pro-Indianness. BIPOC is not a word that I would use. I eliminate it from anything that I produce. There's not a BIPOC country. Yo sé que hay Cuba, yo sé que hay Santo Domingo, y Haití, but everybody now, I'm a BIPOC person. Hell no, you're not. Right? Because then you've bought into erasing yourself. Right? So that we have to be very conscious of our narrative and the words that we use. And we have the opportunity to do it because we are in forums like this that enlighten us. And the point is, don't go back to what you were doing that's incorrect. Go forward and change it, right?
Thank you.
That's the future.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers of this event for making this conversation possible. This kind of conversation doesn't always happen at the conferences and the events that we go to. I hope it becomes the norm when we create forums and places for ourselves. Okay? Thank you so much.